JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is an immensely popular manga and anime series that is seemingly inexplicably, ridiculously popular among queer people. That might not seem weird at first. Queer people are allowed to like all sorts of media after all, and with JoJo's mainstream popularity in other countries, it might seem weird to single out this series as specifically popular among queer folk. And yet, despite JoJo's being a series wherein there are only two explicitly queer characters, who are both major villains, JoJo's is a series that many queer people, critics and lay alike, will claim is explicitly written for queer people by the mangaka Hirohiko Araki. I'm not kidding either. Here is May Leitz, a trans woman film critic who runs the excellent channel Nick's Fears, tweeting that Araki writes manga specifically for trans people. And here's 5 more people responding to that same tweet asking who Araki writes for with the gays. This is far from scientific polling, of course, but with those responses combined with my own personal experience interacting with other queer fans of JoJo's, there seems to be a lot of queer people claiming that this series is written explicitly for them. I would also gladly include myself in that group as well. As a queer trans woman, I have also always felt like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure was written for me, and people like me. Putting my finger on exactly why I and other queer folk felt this way was always difficult though, as the lack of explicit representation meant that I could only point to this vague feeling I had, rather than anything specific to the text. Let's back up a bit though, and talk about what JoJo's actually is. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is a shonen battle manga that began running in 1987, and it recounts the increasingly bizarre, supernaturally themed adventures of the members of the Joestar family, who are usually nicknamed JoJo. The series is divided into 8 separate parts, each of which follows a different JoJo as its main protagonist, and varies widely in terms of genre and setting. Part 1, Phantom Blood, is a gothic horror set in Victorian England that follows Jonathan Joestar, a very sweet and good boy. Part 3, Stardust Crusaders, is a globe-trotting action-adventure that follows Jotaro Kujo, a silent badass troublemaker. And Part 7, Steel Ball Run, is a classical western that follows Johnny Joestar in a cross-continental horse race. Clearly, JoJo's is a highly varied and somewhat unpredictable series, but even with how varied all these parts are, one thing that was consistent with my experience reading and watching each part is that the story feels fundamentally queer, with that feeling only growing with each part. On the surface, the most obvious detail that suggests queerness is Araki's art style. He frequently poses traditionally hyper-masculine characters like Jonathan Joestar in soft, feminine poses, and in later parts, fills the entire main cast with effeminate-looking men, whose overall style and soft features are directly inspired by fashion models. Within Araki's art, there's also a more nebulous feature that's difficult to pin down. It often feels like Araki is using the male gaze in his drawings, but directing it towards the men and women in his stories either equally or much more heavily towards the men. While this is difficult to describe, it's fairly obvious on its face once you see it. And while I don't condone actively speculating about a real person's sexuality based on their creative work, the use of the male gaze on the men in Araki's work feels very much like the kind of thing that someone would only be able to do so genuinely if they were attracted to men. The details of Araki's art are not the only contributor to that feeling of queerness though, and even with them in mind, the series has certainly felt very queer since the beginning, when the art style fell more in line with the traditional shonen power fantasy, with the only potentially queer aspect being the traditionally feminine poses applied to the main character. If we want to figure out what has made JoJo's Bizarre Adventure feel so queer since Phantom Blood, the first part in the series, we're going to have to dive a lot deeper. Part 1, a summary of Phantom Blood. Dio Brando, son of the abusive alcoholic Dario Brando, is sent by his father to the Joestar family after he dies, as George Joestar believes that Dario once saved his and his son's lives. Dio is accepted into the family, but immediately starts antagonizing Jonathan, George's son and the protagonist of this part, in subtle ways, while always making sure to appear as if he is perfectly behaved to George. Dio's torment of Jonathan goes pretty deep as well. He gets in a boxing match with Jonathan, and not only wins handily, but makes sure to cause Jonathan as much pain as possible. He discovers Jonathan is starting an adorable courtship with Erina Pendleton, and swoops in on her, stealing her first kiss away from Jonathan in order to try and destroy their relationship. He even kicks Jonathan's dog when they first meet, just because he thinks Jonathan looks like a rich, whiny brat, and this all eventually pushes Jonathan to the edge, culminating in an immensely satisfying fistfight between the two boys where Jonathan handily kicks Dio's ass and truly stands up to him for the first time. Dio retaliates for this in secret by killing Jonathan's dog, but for the most part, the two of them are on peaceful terms for the next 7 years, until Jonathan discovers that Dio has been poisoning George in order to try and claim the family fortune for himself. After Jonathan proves to his father and the police that Dio has been poisoning George, Dio, in an act of desperation, tries to kill Jonathan and use his blood to activate an Aztec stone mask, which will transform him into a vampire. George sacrifices himself for Jonathan though, taking the knife to his heart, but Dio is still able to activate the mask, sacrificing his humanity to become a vampire. Jonathan burns down the Joestar family mansion in order to try and stop Dio, but Dio manages to survive thanks to his vampiric powers. When Jonathan learns of this, he teams up with a man who teaches him magical breathing kung fu, or the Ripple, that can defeat Dio, fighting Dio's minions along the way to their final confrontation. Jonathan is able to dispatch Dio by using the Ripple, but Dio manages to just barely survive by decapitating himself, and with the help of one of his minions, sneaks aboard a ship taking Jonathan and Erina on their honeymoon. Dio confronts Jonathan and quickly overwhelms him, telling Jonathan that because of his strength, he plans to use his vampiric powers to take Jonathan's body as his own. Jonathan uses the last of his strength to blow up the ship they are on, though, and has Erina escape in order to save the life of an innocent child, and unbeknownst to him, his own child inside Erina. In their last moments, Jonathan holds Dio close to him, keeping him still as the ship is destroyed, and appears to take both their lives. Part 2: Queerness and Vampires. Now, based on that summary, you're probably wondering the same thing I was. What the hell is queer about that story? Because that's certainly the question I was left with, despite an overriding sensation that what I'd experienced was absolutely unapologetically queer. The story does technically have a queer character. Dio is later revealed to be bisexual, and he at the very least is coded as queer in this story. Araki wanted to make Dio's queerness explicit, but Phantom Blood was written in the 1980s, and his publisher has always blocked him from including explicitly queer representation, even as late as the early 2000s. Yet, even with Dio present, the story at most seems to be about bullying and abuse, which, while common to the queer experience, are not inherently queer themes. Any queer reading of this story is also complicated further by the use of vampires, which, while typically uses avenues to display queerness in media without being explicit, a topic that's explored in depth in Now You See It's excellent video, The Power of the Vampire Myth, does not seem to have anything to do with queerness in this story. After becoming a vampire, Dio describes his transformation as throwing away his humanity, and the most explicitly sexually coded scenes of vampiric desire are the scenes in which Dio is draining the life from women, or forcing women into his servitude after turning them into his vampiric zombies. Araki's refusal to use vampirism's traditional connection to queerness ultimately left me lost, wondering just what it was that made Phantom Blood feel so queer. Until it hit me. The very thing that defines Dio's relationship to queerness is actually kind of obvious. It's his self-hatred. Dio's self-hatred lies at the core of his character, but it's never made explicit why such a talented and clever young man would hate himself, even as it's clear why he hates the world around him. But hating himself because of his queerness? Because of something intrinsic to himself that prevents him from connecting to most other people who aren't queer? That makes sense. That squares with his character perfectly. Dio is a queer man who loathes his own queerness, and he has been taught by society how to do so from childhood on. His life at the dregs of society showed him that his queerness and difference will never be accepted, and he lashes out at himself and those closest to him in order to try and drive out his and their queerness, ultimately destroying the only two loving relationships in his life as a result. And as soon as I realized that, another realization snapped into place. Dio is not the only person queer-coded in Phantom Blood. Jonathan is queer-coded too. Just like Dio, Jonathan is looked down upon and treated poorly by people from his societal class, and is mistreated by his father, albeit much less harshly, like Dio as well. Sure, we see Jonathan romance and eventually marry Erina, but there is never any real meat to their relationship. Even when Erina becomes pregnant, we aren't shown any of their intimacy, or even a scene implying it. In fact, the only moments of heterosexual intimacy in Phantom Blood come from Dio violating consent or manipulating women into consent. He forcibly steals Erina's first kiss away from Jonathan and draws on the servitude of his vampirically hypnotized thralls. We do get to see a few moments of genuine intimacy in Jonathan's final moments, however. As the ship around him explodes, we see Jonathan embrace Dio, choosing to spend his last breath with the man who was as close to him as a brother, while he sends his wife away from him. Whether you want to interpret this as an act of brotherly love between two estranged family members, or as a romantic embrace, it is very clear that Jonathan loves Dio in some regard, and it's incredibly significant that the only moments of true, consensual intimacy in Phantom Blood are shared by two men. And if we choose to read Jonathan as a queer man who has romantic feelings for Dio, a fascinating contrast between the two men becomes apparent. Jonathan, unlike Dio, is a queer man who is unapologetically himself and refuses to change or hide who he is, where Dio rejects himself so severely that he would rather be a vampire than accept that he is worthy of love and mercy from those around him. Jonathan's self-love and self-confidence are utterly repulsive to Dio, leading him to try and destroy the good in Jonathan's life as soon as they meet. Even after living together for 7 years, Dio's self-destructive tendencies refuse to allow him to continue as he does, accepted by his peers, and loved by a kind father and brother. He's finally risen up out of the slums and darkness of society, but in his own self-hatred, commits an act of self-harm so damaging that he is literally unable to ever walk in the light again. Dio is a truly tragic queer man. His inability to love and accept himself in his queerness, and subsequent inability to accept the self-love of the man he's closest to, drives him back to the dark corners of society he was lifted out of by the Joestars. And even more tragically, turning into a vampire leads Dio further away from his inner truth, as he must lie to himself and claim that he has risen above humanity, rather than fallen into darkness and a horror of his own making. Jonathan's fate is similarly tragic, as his love for Dio blinds him to the truth that he who he called brother has fallen and cannot be saved. And it only gets darker when you consider the ultimate fate of Jonathan, as in Dio's jealousy of Jonathan's self-love and acceptance, he severs Jonathan's head and steals his body for his own. This theft leaves him with the body of Jonathan that he loved, but still ultimately destroys what made Jonathan who he was, his kind, gentle, and loving soul. Part 3. Battle Tendency and Beyond. Knowing that Phantom Blood is about the tragic fate of two queer men, it becomes a lot easier to see how queerness affects the rest of the series, as the following parts of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure are all about the legacy of trauma left by Dio's actions towards Jonathan. Part 3, Stardust Crusaders, is about the return of Dio, and is dedicated to showing just how much more dangerous Dio becomes when he has grown past his self-hatred, while still embracing the cruelty and external hatred he learned as a child. Part 5, Vento Aureo, is about Dio's son, and follows a group of queer gangsters as they attempt to take over the gang from within, with Giorno Giovanna specifically representing what Dio could have become if he had been shown kindness in his life before it was too late. Part 6, Stone Ocean, is about Dio's queer lover, Pucci, a similarly self-hating Catholic priest, attempting to fulfill Dio's own legacy by following Dio's final wishes. And while Dio and his legacy doesn't tie directly into Part 2 or 4, knowing how queer the rest of the series is makes interpreting the queerness of these parts a lot easier, as we can give Araki the benefit of the doubt when he writes the queerness more subtly. Part 2, Battle Tendency, is about Joseph Joestar, the bisexual grandson of Jonathan, whose disaffected, rebellious nature make him unable to fit into society, until he faces off against a group of queer foes who see themselves as above society, and are actively working to transcend it, an act that would leave society decimated if they got their own way. Once he's defeated them, he is able to settle down, finally seeing the value of being part of society, without having to give up what makes him himself. A key part of Battle Tendency's story is also Joseph lacking the guidance of a queer role model for most of the story. It isn't until Joseph meets Lisa, who can be reasonably interpreted as at least somewhat queer, and definitely gender non-conforming, is he able to come to that true acceptance of himself. With only the guidance of his grandma Erina, he ends up ultimately lost and disaffected from the world, since he has no queer men to look up to in his life. And it's only by meeting his long-lost mother, Lisa, a queer woman, that he's able to grow into that acceptance. Part 4, Diamond is Unbreakable, represents a growth on Araki's part, however, and in many ways, a rejection of the theme of accepting one's place in society. The main villain of this arc, Yoshikage Kira, is the very embodiment of a quiet life, outwardly behaving like a very normal, ordinary person, while having a sinister hidden life, where he murders young women for his own amusement. Kira is coded as queer, and the implication seems to be that hiding your full self, queerness included, is a mark of evil. Meanwhile, our main cast is filled with loud, brash, and outwardly queer characters who all show that living as yourself and refusing to fit into a societal mold is a sign of goodness and morality. Josuke, our main protagonist, is the most brash of the cast, and he is constantly coming up with childish schemes and plots, often at the expense of others around him. Yet, at the end of the day, his ultimate power is to heal people, and we see that underneath his troublemaking immaturity is a heart of gold. Koichi, who is almost as important a protagonist as Josuke, is implied to be aromantic and/or asexual, and grows from a shy, subdued kid who doesn't stand up for himself to being as strong-willed as Josuke, without ever losing his intrinsic kindness. Even Okuyasu, who is not coded queer, begins to live his best life when he exits the literal shadows of an abandoned house, and starts to join Josuke in his outwardly brash lifestyle. I could probably keep going from here. The deeper you dive into the text of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, the more queerness you find. But for now, I think that I've given you a good taste of the queerness in JoJo's. If you're queer and have never read or watched this series before, and can handle some violence and gore, I highly recommend giving it a shot. There is genuinely nothing else out there like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, especially in terms of media that feels like it was made for queer people without ever pandering to them, or even being explicitly about queerness or the struggle of being queer, and it is easily one of my favorite series of all time. Alright, thank you all so much for watching. I adore JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, like, a ton, and this is something I've wanted to write about since I first stumbled across the show, and I didn't even know that I wanted to write about it, because I started watching the show before I fully came out as trans. But anyway, if you liked this video, leave a like, comment, let's talk about JoJo's in the comments. Tell me who the best JoJo is, because the best JoJo is Joseph Joestar, and I will hear no arguments to the contrary. Josuke is second best, though. If you want to see more content like this video, you can subscribe to my channel, and if you want to help support making content like this possible, I have a Patreon if you want to do a monthly recurring donation, and if you don't want to do that but still want to help financially support this project, I have a paypal.me link as well in the description. You can send me a one-time donation, basically helping to make making videos like this become a viable career for me. Again, thank you all for watching so much. I love every single one of you. I'll talk to you all later.